My name is John Cusey. I'm Director of Government Relations at the American Enterprise Institute. And on behalf of AEI, I want to welcome Senator Bill Cassidy, who is here to open our discussion entitled The U.S. Shale Revolution and the Geopolitics of Energy. Dr. Cassidy represents the state of Louisiana, which is our second largest crude oil producing state and third largest natural gas producer. As a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee when he served in the House, he has consistently promoted increasing production of America's energy resources as a way to grow the economy and create good-paying jobs. Before coming to Congress, Dr. Cassidy provided care for uninsured and underinsured patients in Louisiana's charity hospital system, including co-founding the Greater Baton Rouge Community Clinic, a clinic providing free dental and health care to the working uninsured. AEI has enjoyed working with Dr. Cassidy in the past because he is serious about policy and he cares about how that policy impacts people, especially the vulnerable. Please help me welcome Senator Bill Cassidy.
Thank you. 27 years ago, I think it was, Paul Kennedy wrote a book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. His thesis, when we Googled it, because I kind of remembered it but not quite, was that great powers must be judged relative to other great powers, and great power indices correlate strongly with the use of natural resources and economic durability. And as I recall, he had lots of charts that, because it's, again, 27 years since I read it, but you remember the charts, man. If you get through, you remember the charts. Correlating strongly that per capita use of energy just went with economic development and great power status. Now, I think that's important in kind of this discussion here as regards energy and geopolitical issues. Now, that said, let me go to the next point. I think to forecast energy, no offense to any panelists, is a fool's game. Who would have predicted 1973? When I was elected 6 years ago to the Congress, there was a testimony given about peak oil. Now we have the shale play. 4 years ago, I was told, despite the kind of onset of shale play, that economic demand in India and China was going to drive up costs so high that despite the incipient oil play, there would nonetheless be prices so high that it would inhibit our economy. Now, prices are so low, we're not sure we can produce. So to predict something which is so regularly unpredictable doesn't seem the thing we should focus on. I think it's rather better to think of ourselves relative to other great powers. What made us a great power? How can we have the economic durability that allows us to sustain ourselves? And inevitably, I think Kennedy's thesis 27 years ago is still true. That relates in part to the ability to command and develop and produce natural resources, principally oil and gas is the discussion here today. Now, just to point this out, the fact that we have had both ultra-deep drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and the shale play in places such as Louisiana, Texas, the developments in North Dakota and Canada have lowered our gas prices directly or indirectly. Now, how has this impacted our geopolitical position? Because we are judged relative to others. Well, Venezuela, who hates us and formerly would use their money to fund groups that hated us, they need oil to be at $151 a barrel to balance their budget. Iran needs $131 a barrel to balance their budget. Russia needs $103 a barrel to balance their budget. And now Brent crude is going for $60 a barrel. And it appears it will do so for the next several years. Those geopolitical rivals are going to be undermined, not because we've pulled a single pistol out of the holster, but rather because we are pulling oil and gas out of the ground. Now, this clearly weakens those positions their position relative to ours. Also important to note that 50% of Russia's annual budget is funded by oil and gas development. 50%. In fact, by the way, there's precedent for this. I remember when Saudi Arabia flooded the oil market during the Reagan administration. That's when the Soviet Empire collapsed. They needed the money to maintain their military-industrial complex, and I remember seeing pictures of rusted tanks. They could not afford to maintain, and so therefore the Soviet Empire fell. Now, it isn't, though, just undermining the economy of others, because, by the way, capitalism is not zero-sum. Some folks say, well, my gosh, we've got to keep all our oil and gas for ourselves because to allow others to have our low-price oil and gas is to take away the advantage our economy has and to transfer that advantage to another. Capitalism is not zero-sum. If the middle class worldwide gets richer, our middle class will be richer still. And that's the wonderful thing about freedom and markets, because most likely we'll continue to be the most free and market-oriented economy in the world. So, again, going back to the Reagan years, there was a worldwide recession. The United States consciously became the engine of economic growth that pulled Western Europe out of a recession. You can see our continued kind of not doing well has hurt the world economy. Of course it should. We are the largest economy in the world. And think about it. If we exported natural gas, which some people say, no, we cannot do because we have an advantage having that natural gas domestically and we don't want to transfer this gas to others, there is a significant transfer cost of both the cooling, compression to liquefy the natural gas, the transport to other countries, and the ability to bring that gas back up to where it can be used and then shipped to ultimate use. There's also the additional cost where the United States petrochemical plants have changed their feedstock from oil to natural gas. For petrochemical companies in Western Europe to do this, for example, they would have to invest the hundreds of millions of dollars we already have invested to do the same thing. So, arguably, if we export natural gas, we will not equilibrate, but we will make it better. And that is a good thing. When Europe is more prosperous, they buy more American goods. When China is more prosperous, they buy more American goods. We believe in markets, and our belief in markets should continue when it comes to the belief in markets of petrochemical. But let me take my thesis a little bit further. The durability of an economy. Right now, under this administration, the rich have gotten richer and the middle class have stagnant wages. Since 2009, if you've owned stocks, you've done pretty well. But since 2009, if you pull a wrench, you're not doing so well. There's a set of policies which is prejudicial against the middle class, the blue-collar workers, the working families, that this administration has instituted. Key example, Keystone XL pipeline, which would create 40,000 construction jobs. When those on the left minimize that by saying, well, they're temporary jobs, by definition, construction jobs are temporary unless we're building the Great Wall of China. But when you speak to those craft union presidents, they will say, my welder needs 3 weeks of straight work so that he can meet his union quarterly hour requirement and still qualify for benefits. I can go down the list, but it's so intuitive that Keystone XL pipeline creating 40,000 jobs according to President Obama's State Department is a good thing. I could also list, by the way, according to his State Department, it will decrease the carbon footprint, it will save lives, in addition to those 40,000 jobs. All the things that theoretically we are all for. In this case, those who are pro-market are clearly more for them than those who oppose Keystone XL pipeline. Other examples I could give, though. Louisiana, Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, other energy-producing states have created over the last certain number of years an incredible number of blue-collar working jobs. Oil and gas industry, just some statistics. The American oil and natural gas industry supports 8.4 million full and part-time jobs. Since 2008, the oil and gas industry has created 208,900 direct jobs and an additional 600,000 indirect jobs. My dad moved to Louisiana in 1958, bouncing between different communities, never quite gaining traction. But he had heard that if he moved to Louisiana, he could sell to the men and women working at Esso, as ExxonMobil was then called, and could make a living. My dad ended up making a great living. A man without a college education, his son's a U.S. Senator. The power of the industry is it created opportunity for my dad, who sold life insurance. The ripple effect of this is tremendous. Now, if Paul Kennedy's thesis is correct, that great powers must be judged vis-a-vis one another, and also as regards their use of natural resources, specifically fossil fuel, and their economic durability, I would argue that if we are going to continue to be a great power, we know developing our own oil and gas resources undermines the economies of our enemies, promotes the economies of our friends. It contributes to working class, middle class prosperity in this country, which in turn contributes to our economic durability, all of that which is a recipe for us to maintain great power status. By the way, not for the sake of being a great power, but for the sake of those families that otherwise would not do as well would we not have these policies in place. I'll stop, take whatever questions you have.
Stay where you are.
Sure.
Since we don't have a microphone for anyone, I will try to summarize and repeat the question for the camera. So does anybody have any questions for Senator Cassidy?
Yes, sir.
Derek.
We identify in the report, and a lot of other people do as well, the factors that allow the U.S. shale revolution to occur, and that other countries are consciously imitating or failing to imitate. You're on the front lines, in an oil-producing state with a lot of experience. What would you say? What would you pick out as the reason the United States was able to do this before everyone else? Obviously, you have to have shale. Lots of countries have shale. Why did we do this first? It's complicated, I understand that, but I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on what made it work here first and may not make it work elsewhere.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick for the camera, what factors made the U.S. first in the shale revolution?
Yeah. So you need an economist to completely elucidate this, and you're an economist probably, man, so you should probably be the one answering your own question. But I will point out, that I think was a man's name George Eliot, the Texan George Mitchell, who just had an idea. And there was some federal research that had been done to precede that, and there were others doing work as well. The Halliburton people once told me that they played as well. But here is a fellow that just had an idea and the freedom to pursue it and the ability to get capital investment. And with capital investment, he has done more to create jobs in the United States of America than the stimulus package. And as opposed to running up our deficit, the royalty payments generated and the jobs created have lowered our deficit. It is the power both of an individual, of an industry, but also of markets. There's tax code issues involved as well as we look to change tax code related to oil and gas exploration. Keep in mind, I'm sure there were some tax benefits that encouraged this sort of activity. And I'm sure there was venture capital. It is capital, ideas, entrepreneurship. By the way, I think our economy is driven by entrepreneurs. George Mitchell was some kind of entrepreneur. Anyone else? One back there.
Thank you. So with the shale revolution, we'd be looking at producing more oil, which would, flood the market, and it would also increase our dependence on the Middle East.
Wait. Say that one more time, man, because I'm starting to lose you.
I think I rambled. The shale revolution would increase our dependence on the Middle East. Now, do we need to worry about China picking up our slack in the Middle East? Are they a viable alternative to support the regime that will be threatened by an increase in U.S. oil?
So if we're not dependent, or if the Middle East, if we're not engaged with the Middle East on oil, does that mean that opens up for China to be more of a player there and prop those regimes up?
I would argue we now have a market for oil, whereas formerly we had a cartel. And the fact that the Saudis cannot support the market by scarcity is an example of that. Now, and I would argue, because I think there's academic research that shows that countries that rely too heavily upon revenue from natural resources actually do worse, although they are innately more wealthy, than countries like Singapore, which rely more upon intellectual capital. It may be a necessary part of their evolution is that they rebase their economy from one subsidized by oil and gas revenue to one in which the people are allowed freedom in order to develop. A lot of talented Iranians that if you just allowed Iranians freedom would develop their country very nicely. That was the power of the Green Revolution. That said, to your basic point, should we fear China's increased role there? China may buy oil and gas from us if our production price is lower. But the more that China is engaged in the capitalistic system, the less likely we are going to have armed conflict. So we want those middle-class Chinese invested in peace as much as middle-class Americans are invested in peace. In one sense, what you ask is an imponderable. As we withdraw, will others fill where we once were? I don't know if we can affect that. But one thing we can do is, going back to Paul Kennedy's statement, is take care of our own position vis-a-vis those other great powers. And we take care of our own position by developing our own natural resources, creating a system of economic durability, which the two go hand in hand, in which case whatever happens elsewhere, our stature remains.
I think we have time for one more question here.
Hi, just wanted to know, Louisiana has a lot of oil services companies in the state. Those are generally being hit a little bit harder than the producers right now. So what's kind of the bounce back period people are looking at in your state? And then second part of the question is, you mentioned Putin in Russia, but have you seen any change in behavior from him even at low prices? And is there a point where that might begin to start having an effect on his actions?
Well, oil field services are, So one of the questions was, in Louisiana in particular, low oil prices have led to problems among oil field services. And for folks not familiar with it, you might be digging a well in the outer continental shelf of the Gulf of Mexico, but you need a boat to bring groceries to the people who are working on that rig. I mean, the expansiveness, so the person, all the way to the person transporting the food to the grocery store, as well as the person loading it on the boat, the person taking the boat out there, the person servicing the boat, the person unloading the boat, are all jobs related to oil and gas development. It is a powerful industry. So your question is, how will it be affected by the lower price? It's going to be affected. I think the length of period that prices remained lower will influence that, obviously. Mitigated a little bit because drilling on the outer continental shelf is a decade-long process. So the companies that are on the OCS are there for the long haul. But case in point, Haynesville Shale in North Louisiana, the price of natural gas has fallen so far, it's fallen below the point where producers wish to produce a gas which is called dry gas, and principally methane. Now, by the way, methane is what would be exported if we get our LNG terminals going. And so when folks say, well, my gosh, we're going to send away this high-value natural gas, more likely we'll reopen the Haynesville and ship so-called dry gas, which folks here in the United States have no use for. You asked one more question after that. Oh, Putin. Go back to the picture I recall as a kid of rusted tanks when the empire fell. Those tanks didn't rust overnight. That lack of maintenance had been occurring for several years. So I don't know we know a time frame by which economic, you're just running on empty is going to affect. But we can look at Venezuela. Venezuela, unable to support its command and control economy, as by all reading, a corrupt economy, is now having unrest. And so their cost to support their economy is $131 a barrel. That's long gone. So they just may be a little bit further in the process than some other countries, which required, say, only $100 a barrel. And that's an intuition, but every now and then you see things lining up and you can kind of predict the future. Thank you all very much for having me.
Please join me in thanking Senator Cassidy.
Thanks, man.
All right, as our panelists move up and take their seats, let me go through and just quickly introduce them and then hand it over to Eli here, who will be moderating. First, on my left here, Eli Ratner. Dr. Eli Ratner is Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Prior to joining CNAS, he served on the China desk at the State Department as the lead political officer covering China's external relations in Asia, and a lot of other accomplishments as well. Derek Scissors is next here in line. He's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Asian economic issues and trends. He focuses on the Chinese and Indian economies and U.S. economic relations with China and India. Sarah, hopefully I don't say this too wrong. Victory? Close. All right. Dr. Victoria is an international recognized expert on the energy market and security. She has extensive experience in global energy market studies, energy security, and geopolitical risk. And she is at SVB Energy International. And last but not least, I think, is Dan Blumenthal. He's the Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Eli.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I've been relieved of my first task, the introduction. So thanks for everyone coming out today. As said, my name is Eli Ratner. I'm from CNAS. We have a great group here today to talk about the geopolitics of energy and a fantastic new report out of AEI that any viewers at home, but also folks in the room should pick up on their way out if you don't have it already. As a fellow think tanker, I will say there is a wide variation in the quality of work that gets produced at Washington think tanks. And I think AEI's reports, the earlier Japan Energy LNG report that Dan was a part of, and this one as well, is a real first-rate piece of scholarship. So encourage folks to take a close look at it when you get a chance. So we're going to dig into this issue today. We have about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to kick off with about a half hour of discussion and questions, and then we can open it up to the broader audience. I'll just say at the top, at CNAS, we're working on some of these issues as well. It's such an expansive topic insofar as it gets at almost every issue in international politics: Russia sanctions, ISIS, the rise of China, Iranian nuclear weapons, U.S. politics, climate change. There's almost no issue in international politics that isn't in some way affected by some of these major trends and movements in global energy markets. So I think we'll touch on hopefully some of them today, if not all. So I'm going to start with Derek, and I think just for folks who don't spend quite as much time on these issues, maybe provide a bit of a scene setter for the group. Senator Cassidy mentioned there have been huge changes in global energy markets that folks didn't necessarily anticipate, or even if they did, they're profound in their effect. The report cites two big trends: an increase in U.S. production and a decrease in, or at least slowing of Chinese demand. So Derek, how significant are these trends? How are they affecting global energy markets? And can you paint the picture today of global demand, production, and trade flows versus where we thought we were going seven years ago or so?
I'll try. Obviously, I'll try briefly. Senator Cassidy already quite well got to some of this. In 2008, and I say this because I don't like Goldman Sachs, so anyone working for Goldman Sachs in the audience, just get ready. Goldman Sachs famously predicted $200 a barrel oil. We now have people predicting $20 a barrel oil. And Senator Cassidy is exactly right that, once you take a line and you just extend it, it's always going to go up, it's always going to go down. The energy market's going to totally prove you wrong. But to go from a $200 barrel oil to a $20 barrel oil prediction in less than 7 years is, it's enormous. The budget statistics that the senator cited, that's because those countries thought the good times were never going to end. They became really irresponsible. We have some irresponsibility in this country too. I don't mean to just point fingers at other people, but the reason that their budgets are so out of control is because they believe Goldman Sachs. And they got themselves into a deep hole, and it's going to be very difficult to get out of it. So we all see at the pump what expecting $200 barrel oil and then expecting $20 barrel oil does. We've had oil prices drop from $3.50 a gallon around the country to $1.50 a gallon. And that's not just what's happening today, it's what people are expecting in the future. And then internationally, we have a bunch of countries that have dug themselves a huge hole. And we don't know where that's going to go. They haven't felt the full impact of the energy market yet. This is going to, if oil started recovering tomorrow, we'd still see a lot of pain in a lot of producers. We think of Russia and Iran because they're rivals of ours, but it's not just Russia and Iran. It's marginal producers like Nigeria. And if you're not following events in Nigeria, there's a lot of unrest in Nigeria. It's very violent, ugly unrest. And the economic situation is probably not going to get better for a while. So there are a lot of implications, and I touch on all of them. One thing I want to say about the geopolitics of this, which is not really my area, I'll talk about the economic input. The reason I asked the senator that question is, it's not clear the shale revolution is going to leave the United States. I mean, it came out in the United States because we have all the factors necessary, at least until politics gets involved, which hopefully it won't, to have this kind of revolution. We have deep property rights for individuals. If I own land in Louisiana and there's shale on it, that shale belongs to me. Around the world, that's not true, almost anywhere. We have deep financial markets. We reward entrepreneurship. We protect people's intellectual property. We allow competition in energy, as you guys know. Who's leading the shale revolution? Is it Exxon? No. Is it ConocoPhillips? No. It's little guys. So that one thing that's interesting to think about the energy market in the world is we keep expecting shale production to soar everywhere else. It may not. There's uncertainty here, as the senator was talking about, but we may have a situation where the U.S. just has the best energy industry on the planet for 15 or 20 years. I'll stop there.
All right, let me just follow that up before moving on to Sarah and ask her a similar question about the Middle East, which is to ask you about China in particular, follow on to the comments you just made. Obviously, one of the things that they do in the report is lay out future scenarios and actually rate their likelihood, which I thought was bold to do, which people don't always do when they make these kinds of assessments. But one of the key factors there, one of the arguably the big variable running through these are the likelihood of the reform of the Chinese economy. So again, I know you could probably talk for 3 years straight nonstop on the Chinese economy and reform and China's economic difficulties, but maybe in short, tell us about the trouble the Chinese economy is in right now, the types of reforms that would be necessary, and why you are hopeful or not that those may occur.
So the big factor in energy is U.S. shale, but the second biggest factor, and the report brings this out, especially Dan's closing chapter, is that China is different than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. We had this period of voracious Chinese energy demand, and it was driven by two things: a rapidly growing economy and a lousy energy sector that was inefficient, didn't produce any of its own energy, couldn't keep up with the Chinese economy. Well, now we've got a Chinese economy that's slowed very dramatically.
different kinds of measures of growth have slowed at least by half since 2008, at least. Could be worse depending on what you want to use. And that there doesn't seem to be any change coming in that trajectory. So in terms of the world energy market, in terms of U.S.-China rivalry, the number one factor here is the Chinese economy is just slowing. A second factor is their energy sector isn't getting better yet. Maybe it will, but it hasn't gotten yet. So they're still inefficient in energy, and their economy's slowing. They look pretty weak on that score. Now, you never want to say that things can't change because we've seen pretty big policy changes. I won't go into history, but China had a pretty big policy change in the late 1970s that you guys don't even remember. China was poorer than India in 1976. I mean, so you can dig yourself out of a really big problem, and China can too, either economic or energy reforms. On the energy reforms, I'll just say, because I don't want to spend too much time, they're not doing the right thing. And the way you know they're not doing the right thing was reported in the Wall Street Journal last week. The Wall Street Journal last week has China, which has 3 oil companies, 3, saying 3 is too many. We'd like 2. Well, I just made this comment about the U.S. Exxon and ConocoPhillips did not cause the U.S. shale revolution. Competition caused the U.S. shale revolution in part. The Chinese are going in the wrong direction. So we see no evidence of energy reform that's going to make their energy sector stronger. On the big issue of the Chinese economy, they're talking a lot, and that's better than what they were doing 4 years ago, because 4 years ago they weren't even talking about reform, but they're not doing anything yet. So if you had to take a bet, you know, we're at the center of the world, and I'm involved in anyone in this room, where people talk and don't do anything, you know, politicians in China talk and don't do anything too. So the talk over there of reform has not materialized in something hard, like breaking up state-owned enterprises, like privatizing part of the banking system, like giving farmers more rights to their land, like giving workers more rights to move wherever they want in the country, things we take for granted here. They haven't done that. And until you see them do something hard, the best prediction is their economy is going to continue to slow down until it just stalls. And that has huge implications for global energy because global energy demand, and Senator even referenced this, has been driven by China. China's going to buy more and more and more and more. Not going to happen.
Okay. Sarah, then talk to us about the Middle East. So we're you know, from, again, if we're thinking about changes in key trends, we have, over the last several years, a boom in American production, which is challenging producers in the Middle East. We have depression of Asian demand, which was the hopeful big economy, and still is in some ways for Middle East producers, and we have the region itself in some ways falling apart. So if that's the highest level of abstraction, give us a little more granularity about how these trends are affecting the energy markets in the Middle East.
Sure. Well, it was very tough to finish the Middle East chapter because when we started, there was no ISIS in Iraq and the prices were not dropped that much. So we had to revise it and keep including the different factors. Something in this scenario that we looked is just obviously the production in the Middle East region is going to increase. Both for natural gas and crude oil. But something interesting that is happening with Middle East is that their demand is growing too. So as much as the production and production is growing, their demand is increasing. So in our forecast, Middle East is going to successfully maintain its current market share, particularly in the oil market, but they are not able to increase their market share further, and that's because of their rising demand. The reason for that, lower efficiency and lots of energy waste, because in most of the countries in the Middle East, there is a huge fuel subsidies and their fuel prices are not very expensive, so they're wasting a lot of energy and they're consuming a lot of energy. And we are expecting, particularly in transportation system, households and industry, their demand to grow. Also, they're going to, their industries are growing, particularly in petrochemical fields, and this caused them to consume more energy at home. We looked at 3 different key players. I mean, what are the key players really in Middle East that could increase and contribute a lot to the production increase? And the main key players that we identified were Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. Well, in our scenario, Saudi Arabia is not looking to have more oil because they already have enough that they can produce. Particularly, that scenario makes more sense now with the current low oil prices. However, Saudi Arabia is looking for expanding its natural gas production capacity, and the reason for that is they need their demand is increasing, so they always want to keep that portion of oil export capacity and their power in the market. Also, they're expanding their refinery capacity. But again, increasing their natural gas, it will help them to move from crude oil and refined petroleum to natural gas in their electricity sector. Also will help the kingdom to change the feedstock of its petrochemical factories from liquid fuel and naphtha to natural gas, which is more economically beneficial. Also could compete with American petrochemical industry further. Then, so we didn't really see any further like expansion of crude oil export capacity from Saudi Arabia until the duration of our report, 2030. The next key player was Iraq. Well, Iraq did a major reform, and they signed a lot of contracts with investors, long-term contracts, and they eagerly and rapidly they were increasing their production. There were lots of different forecasts. We refer to different ones. There were some going high to like 9 barrels to 13 barrels per day by 2030. But what we are expecting, particularly with the ISIS problem, and now that most of the international companies have left this country, is that they are not going to have more than 5 to 6 million barrels, 6 to 7 million barrels per day by then. And main reason for that is that Iraq also has other problems to tackle beside ISIS, and that's infrastructure, water, electricity, banking system, so, and also a hydrocarbon law. And the other side, there is a Kurdistan side and central Iraq's rivalry, that these are adding to the challenges for Iraqi government to expand its production capacity. The next key player for us is Iran. Well, Iran's production at its highest after at the highest ever was 6 million barrels per day. This is before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And the highest after the revolution was 4 million, slightly above 4 million barrels per day around in 2009. However, the production has increased a lot since 2012, and that's because of the further sanctions on Iran's export. But how much is Iran's exact production capacity? Because we know that Iran had to reduce its production because they couldn't export more because of the limitations. But how much they are really able to produce? So the estimates that Iranian foreign ministry makes is between 3.5 to 3.7. They don't know exactly because they are not able now to produce at their highest. So their production capacity is already lower than 4 million. So what will happen in the long term in their building their production capacity, if Iran successfully reached to a deal with P5+1 and they're successfully gaining some more international companies coming and investing and bringing technology. Of course, at the current prices, there's not enough money left in their pocket to put more effort in their own industry. We are expecting that Iran could rise its production to 4 million barrels per day production capacity. If things go very well, slightly to 5 by 2030. But we don't see that more than that. And the reason for that is that Iran doesn't have so much ambition to increase its oil production capacity. Iran is changing its oil export capacity as a strategy and that happens in the last 2 years because of the sanctions, to be a refined product exporter mainly. And the reason for that is, of course, they make more value added when they produce production and they export production rather instead of crude oil, and they will supply their domestic need of gasoline and other fuels. And also that's the best strategy with them competing with their neighbors, particularly Saudi Arabia. We already have news from some of our clients that one of Iranian main Asian buyers is tackling from stopping renewing their long-term contracts for purchasing crude oil with Iran, and the reason for that is simply at the current market, Saudis are giving a better offer. And why that is not happening, that's the State Department, because it's easy for a State Department to deal with one country that is more transparent in order to keep the limitations on Iran. So for Iran, Iran is going to, by 2017, if things go successfully for Iran, they can absorb enough investment and can work on their building their refinery capacity. Their refinery capacity is going to increase by 3.3 million barrels per day. And if their production capacity raised to 4 million, or to 5 million, their export capacity is not going to change a lot from what it's now today. So we don't expect that Middle East is going to contribute hugely to the oil market. However, we're expecting Saudi gas and Iran's gas to increase. If this happens, Iran will have export capacity, could compete in a natural gas and condensate market. Saudi Arabia is going to mainly use its natural gas at home.
So let me ask then, with and this is a market question that I know a lot of people are asking. No one knows exactly the answer to, but how robust is American production in the face of some of these uncertainties? With if the Saudis, for instance, don't intervene in the market and the price does stay very low, if not all, we don't want to paint an overly robust scenario, but if some or any of these new production come online, but particularly the low price picture, because as you know, for people who haven't spent as much time on this issue, a lot of the investments and optimism about U.S. production was made at a much higher price. So now that we're in this lower price new normal, or at least more volatile, how, you know, looking out, how confident are you that the United States is going to sustain as a major player here?
Well, I mean, just look at the balance. I mean, I don't think that Saudi reduced the prices. So I think we are giving a lot.
Well, didn't intervene to prop them up.
They didn't intervene, no. I don't think they intervened. What they did is they just mentioned that we are not going to reduce our production in order to keep the prices high. So they didn't push the prices lower, or they didn't cause the prices to come. And I would say that what really caused the prices coming down was the massive expansion of U.S. oil, crude oil production, and which mainly comes from shale. And if you're like Saudi's oil minister, what are you going to do? Why are you leaving your market share for American, you know? And this is for other like OPEC members too, mainly. I mean, they're suffering currently. Senator Cassidy alluded to different, their break-even prices, and they're all, of course, hurting because they're heavily oil-dependent economies. But, of course, they're fighting for their market share. So I don't see Saudis as a major price influencer of pushing price down. They just say we don't reduce it. And of course there are other reasons. I mean, we intend to ignore or undermine the role of the paper market, because the volume of the trade in the oil paper market is at least 7 to 10 times more than the physical market. So any psychological effect in the market is going to accelerate and is going to push the prices faster. And why the price is reduced from 60, 70 to 40 today is just a psychological effect and the function of the oil market. But if you look at it, if you just go to the pricing paper market, there's a lot of uncertainty. So if you look at the option contracts for December, there's a huge difference between the cheapest and the highest, most expensive contracts. And that means that there are people speculating very high oil prices. And the situation in the market now is contango. This means that there are many people already are purchasing oil, for storing it to sell it more. So we think that Saudi's ideal price is between 60 to 70, and that's where American shale oil is comfortably produced still. And if not, until 2016, mid-2016, the production of shale oil is going to reduce enough that the prices are going to be high again. So we don't think that the prices of the shale oil is going to stop. The production is kind of a cycle. The production reduces, there's a less supply in the market, and it's going to push the prices up again.
Okay, great. I think, imagine Derek may want to come back to some of these issues. Dan, let me come down to you. Big geopolitical picture here. The report gets into ideational issues, economic issues, security issues. Why don't you walk us through all the ways in which these trends are affecting American power and influence in the world?
Sure. Thank you very much, Eli. And yeah, so the big headlines are for people who toil more in the national security, China watching, foreign policy realm of things, is that this era of both great Chinese growth as well as the Chinese demand shock that has had a lot of us China watchers and national security people looking at China's behavior in the Middle East, or for that matter, Latin America or Africa or anywhere there might be oil. That demand shock is coming to an end. And that has huge implications for how we think about China and how we think about geopolitics. So that means China is far less frenetic about where it gets its oil and natural gas. It doesn't mean that China stops its behavior in some of these places diplomatically and militarily. It just means it's not on the same frenetic path. So that's number one. Number two is, without doing very much, the U.S. government has benefited from its own free market system and its entrepreneurs to essentially place it in this relatively very advantageous position vis-a-vis its key geostrategic competitor, China. So there's a wealth effect where the United States net national wealth is starting to really, there was a huge gap to begin with between the United States and China, but it's starting to grow. There's this ability to influence allies and friends in the Asia Pacific in terms of being a real reliable energy producer and exporter to them. There's the ability, if the United States decides to do so, decisions made in this Congress and elsewhere, to turn that wealth into power. So if you look at things in terms of net U.S. national wealth and the ability to translate that into things like paying for an adequate military defense or paying for a long-standing diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific region, we have the resources. The question is, when do political leaders know that we have the resources and then have the will to translate that into something else? So in terms of the big story, the big headlines of this kind of linear, inexorable rise of China and decline of the United States, I would say looking at the energy picture, which is obviously a microcosm for so much else, that's over. That story is over, at least in the time period we're talking about it, or unless China undertakes major market reforms. It's the revitalization of the United States and the relative decline of China. And I think that's going to really affect over time the way we think about geopolitics. Now, China, of course, can reverse its fortunes. I mean, it's not in a great position in terms of both its economic stagnation as well as having to still get resources because of its energy inefficiency, as Derek mentioned. It still will be very reliant upon supplies from elsewhere because it won't be able, we predict, to exploit shale reserves. So it still will rely on the Middle East, just less so, and look to Russia and other places. But that means that it is in a position where the United States is interested in general global oil stability in the Middle East, and China might have to get into these very enmeshed, as the senator said, these kind of cartel-like relationships, these supplier relationships. The U.S. has more options than China. Now, geopolitics doesn't just end in the sense of, well, okay, we won that round, let's go home. Our system is better and the rest of it. It's going to continue. China's going to try to reverse its fortunes. So one option we really looked at is how would China do so? And one way would be to get much more involved in one of the big potential oil-producing states like Iran and Iraq and have something much closer to an alliance, which it hasn't had in a long time. Or Russia looks a lot more attractive in terms of both geopolitical alliance and maybe the two of them coming to terms on oil and gas price, which again could create all kinds of new issues and challenges for the United States.
Great. Derek, I have a question for you. Do you want to come in on what, do you want to reflect on what the others have said?
I have millions of things, but I especially have a question for Sarah. So if that's okay.
Yeah.
So we're promoting a discussion here.
Yeah.
So let's say we are at $70 a barrel for a sustained period. So this shakes out. We have production drop. Who are the Middle East producers or other producers, if you can identify them, that are going to suffer the most in that situation? In other words, there are lower cost producers and higher cost producers. There are producers that are more dependent on oil revenue and producers that are less dependent on oil revenue. Not just, please include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, but I'm thinking about where should we look for instability due to $70 barrel oil instead of $105 barrel oil. So I'm not talking about the scenario where like nobody but Saudi Arabia can make oil because it's so cheap. A reasonable price, who's going to suffer under a reasonable price?
You're talking politically?
Yeah, I'm talking about their economies are going to be harmed most because they've been so reliant on relatively expensive oil. I'm not asking you to do a complex political evaluation about what the end game is going to be, but just who's going to get the shock? Who's going to get hit?
Well, I mean, it's very surprising. I lived and worked, and we have so many clients, and we always observe different oil-dependent economy or in Middle East and the major exporters. If you're talking about mainly in the also Persian Gulf, like stream countries, something surprising is that the higher oil price go, the more money they have, the more they spend. So when they have less money, they spend less, and they are more efficient in spending. So it's when we are talking about the even break price, it doesn't mean that they are going to collapse immediately if they have less money. And these high oil prices is something new, you know. I mean, it was not always like this. So we didn't have a decade or like 2 decades of like high oil prices. So what they do, first of all, they adjust their expenses. Some of them, like Saudi Arabia, some more fortunate ones, they have a big fat refunds, foreign reserves that for a certain amount of time they can survive. But I think that they think that 60, 70 is a balance for them. Let's say till 80, what they're looking 70 to 80. If you're looking on Iran, for instance, already like Iran's Minister of Economy said that they are adjusting their oil, but the budget on the price of 40, they might, and he said that the oil minister said that if the prices drop to $20, our oil industry is still going to function. So I don't see this just as a bluff or political statement, but also gives some economic indicator. And if he says that, means that I'm confident that my economy is not going to collapse sometime soon. So I think the range of 60 to 80 prices, 70, 80 prices, is a range that they can adjust their expenses. They're going to be more efficient. They're going to be less waste. Most of these countries are moving, for some will be tougher, but at least Iran has started moving toward reducing their fuel subsidies, which save them a lot of money. Right. So I think they will just be more efficient. I don't see any unrest, or I mean, unless you're looking in like Venezuela or. But something that here I like to mention is just a bit beyond your question is lesson learned from these low oil prices. Something that draw our attention a lot is that the genius Minister of Finance in Mexico, that they hedged their oil. So Mexico, like other major producing countries, are very much depending on their oil export. What they did in the past few years, this is something that's very unusual, that any country, this is the only country that goes every year under a massive sovereign hedge program, and they hedge their portion of oil export that is directly supporting the budget. So they fix a price every year, negotiate with investment banks, and buy the stock, oil stock market in the stock market, and they hedge their oil. So for this year, the price that they negotiated was $76.40. So of course, Mexico, like other oil-producing countries, is losing revenue. 22% is estimated, but this hedging program that they had prevented the country to lose 44%. It cost them $700 million to hedge, roughly above 700, but it is averting a loss of $7 billion. So these are some of the lessons learned and some interesting factors that you suddenly start to focus on, or the energy reform that they undertook. You know, so we think that there are now, of course, many are expecting that some of the projects like the Shale oil and gas in Mexico that are relatively higher might be delayed, but they have fields that the average prices are 20, as low as 12 sometimes, and we think that it's going to attract investors. So something interesting that's going to happen at the end of this lower oil price trend is things would move, you know, investors will change directions.
Let me follow up on that point about the Mexican government being smart about how they're dealing with some of these issues, and the Iranian government adjusting. A question both for Derek and Dan on the U.S. policy side. One, I'm wondering, it's somewhat embedded in this report is, well, you've succeeded because you've stayed out of the way. Get out of the way even more, which was Senator Cassidy's message as well. Beyond the export issue, or maybe you could talk about that as well, if you'd be interested in talking about, or maybe I'll just put it on the table. What are the U.S. policy issues here where the U.S. government should take action, shouldn't take action, whether it relates to the international piece or the domestic piece?
I'll just go first because I want to follow up on something Sarah said. I mean, so Sarah is praising, and I completely agree, it's a great point, the Mexican government for hedging against an oil price shock and for proceeding with reform of the oil industry. Well, the great thing about the United States is we don't have to do any of that. It's already done. The U.S. government isn't involved in hedging against an oil price shock, thankfully, because sometimes governments don't make very smart financial decisions. And we already have a reformed oil industry. So, the reason that Dan and I and AEI in general in this area certainly don't want the U.S. government to be involved is because previous U.S. governments have done the right thing and have created a competitive market, have granted deep property rights to land, have allowed a deep financial system to arise. And the main threat in the United States is political, which is, and we've seen it at the national level, at the state level. I personally think Keystone is a symbolic issue rather than a real issue, but we have seen people try to implement shale bans. If the government doesn't get in the way and doesn't sort of block this industry, we'll do the right thing. We do have the one prime example of government interference. There's a lot of potential government interference, but the real government interference at the national level is blocking exports. And I don't know why it is that Saudi exports are a source of strength for Saudi Arabia and they hurt the United States and they have the advantage over us, but American exports are a terrible idea and will also hurt the United States. It's just like no matter what thing you do in energy, it's bad for the United States. In fact, no, and Mexico's the great counterexample. The Mexicans are doing the right thing, getting away from dependence on a state-run oil company, and the less government involvement, the better. Because we have a competitive industry, we don't rely on one company. We have, some companies are going to bet one way, some companies are going to bet the other way. Some companies are going to bet on the export market, and they'll keep waiting for Indian demand to soar, and if it never does, they lose. And other companies will come in. So we
then, just to push you a little bit on that, then I mean, Dan's talking about allies. We have the Koreans and the Japanese, very import dependent. As we think about moving into the export space, is the answer to just put more on the market and let the market reign, or are there ways to think about preferentially treating certain actors that we want to support? Dan, maybe I'll start with you on that and come back.
Yeah, I mean, this is where sort of the national security, internationalist and the free market person, start to
yell at each other down the hall.
Well, no, inside my own head, not down the hall, because absolutely, in terms of how we got here, the shale revolution it was very much not just the government didn't stay out of the way. In fact, it tried to intervene over the course of at least two administrations in putting its thumb on the scale of certain types of energy. It's just that, and then big oil, of course, lost a story too. It was just that the entrepreneurs in the system kind of overcame that. Yes, I mean you start off in terms of government policy with exports without question and opening the market up. But then there's more. I mean, so there's very tough decisions that have to be made here in Capitol Hill and elsewhere. We're at a time of, at least in my lifetime, the world hasn't been quite as threatening and disordered as it is right now. And so just, an adequate military power everywhere, but in the Pacific in particular, is going to require not just getting out of the way, but Congress and the president getting together and saying, wow, we're pretty wealthy, actually, relative to some of these other countries, and it would take a fraction of that wealth to start to compete vigorously with the Chinese militarily. I mean, that's going to be a government decision. In terms of energy by itself, I mean, there are things we can do with, you mentioned Japan, Korea, Taiwan are all in the same boat in terms of how dependent they are on energy imports. That's a moment. Sometimes the market doesn't work fully, and sometimes diplomacy has to be a piece of that in terms of getting exports into their hands. Just a piece of it, and then the other part of that is some of the countries we really want to become friendlier with in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. There's all kinds of things. I mean, there's the capacity to, in some cases, exploit shale themselves. That we can provide. There is getting in, leading as part of our diplomacy with some of these new actors that we want to befriend. There is the big energy policy piece of it. So how do you become an importer? How do you develop shale yourself? How do you get the transportation infrastructure in place? How are you protected national security-wise? There are a lot of new conversations we can be having with countries we want to win to our side, and that's just the beginning. So in that sense, you can't just sit aside and say the market's going to take care of things.
Can I ask Derek a question here, and then we'll open up, and you can respond to that as well. But Derek, I want to ask you, one of the interesting, when you hear about the U.S. relationship with China, there's a lot of discussion of competition and cooperation. and that mix. And I'm wondering, in this, the discussion so far has been a little bit more on the competitive side. I'm curious, Derek, from your perspective, what do we want China to be when it comes to energy? Because one of the arguments would be, well, we want them to feel more energy secure. We want them to have a cleaner economy. We want them to have a more robust energy market. Them having a inefficient energy market, them not, for instance, not being able to exploit their shale. Is that something we should try to help them with? What do we want to see out of China out of American interest, but also are there opportunities for cooperation there, not just competition?
There are definitely opportunities for cooperation. I'm gonna sidestep sort of this question by giving you the econ answer, which is not rather than the national security answer. I don't know how to answer the question of, is it good for us for China to be weak, or is it good for us for China to be strong and secure? It was a very complicated question and multifaceted, out of my area of expertise. But I'll tell you, the way China becomes better as an energy player is to look more like us, break up its energy monopolies, allow more competition, give more property rights to land, which would be a huge boost for the Chinese economy, not just in energy, starting in agriculture. So, they can delude themselves, as the Russians have, as the Venezuelans have, as many countries have, in thinking, oh, if I set up a big sovereign wealth fund, that'll be the solution, or if a giant energy company will be the solution. But we've seen the giant energy companies just flail. In shale, but also in the oil price shock before that. So that isn't the way to do things. And so for China to actually have a stronger energy industry, they have to become more like us. They have to become more integrated into the global marketplace. And I think that's a good thing. And I'm not saying that everything China does to make itself stronger is good for the U.S. I am not saying that. I'm saying in energy, they'd have to be more like us, and I think that would be helpful. So in this particular area, I think it would be good for the world where you don't have the Chinese needing to have an alliance or something like it with the Russians or the Iranians. You don't have them subsidizing ridiculous regimes in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, because they can do it better themselves. And while they're doing it better themselves, they happen to be becoming a more market-oriented economy. So I think in energy, I'm giving you an econ answer. I'm going for, I want China to succeed, because the way that they can succeed is become more like us. And when they turn back to, hey, I really want to merge my giant oil companies, they're going to become more dependent on everyone else, more hostile to us. That's the wrong direction. It's not good for us, the relationship, the world, anybody, including the Chinese. They're just sort of captivated by special interests. I wanted to say one thing in response to Dan, which is, I've been in a lot of meetings where there are all these U.S. allies who are like, well, when we get more U.S. energy exports, and I'm thinking, how much U.S. energy exports are going to be? They're going to take Europe off of their dependence on Russia. Okay, well, that's a good goal. It's going to take Japan, Korea, Taiwan off of reduce their dependence on through the straits. It's going to bind the U.S. and India together, because we're going to have a big energy relationship, but we don't have that much. And so the reason I'm not saying that I completely agree with Dan. This is very important, and we should be talking about it. It should be an element of our diplomacy. But the reason I don't want to tie energy exports to any country is I just don't think we're smart enough to figure out what the right country is. And it's going to change over time a lot faster than government changes. We hand out export quotas to countries. 5 years later, those quotas are going to be wrong, and we're not going to be able to change them fast enough. So I want energy to be part of our foreign policy. It's absolutely important, and it can help us a lot, but I don't want to tie anything to particular countries, because I think we're going to screw that up.
Not to mention the fact that given the changes in the price of LNG, for instance, you and I were in Tokyo together, I think a couple of years ago, at a time when the price of LNG was probably double what it is now, and American LNG looked very attractive in a way that it isn't necessarily today. Dan, one more, and then we'll...
Let me just comment on both the China piece, and on the allied piece. So, from a diplomatic and geostrategic standpoint, we know who our allies are going to be, and we know who we want our allies to be. So, point taken on prices of energy changing, volatility, as well as how much the United States has. I think when you look at it from a Tokyo perspective, or from a Seoul perspective, or one of the other countries that may want to line up with us in the Asia Pacific, of course there's the question of how much energy is there and at what price, but there's also the question of who can we look to be the reliable supplier, and right now, for the countries that are highly, highly dependent on imports from the Middle East, that's not looking so great. From those who may have dreams of Russia, that's not looking so great. So to the extent we are in a geopolitical competition for power and influence in Asia with the Chinese, and to the extent we have one more tool in our toolkit of national power, I would say that we use it without making huge promises about absolutely taking them off of any one supplier. On the China question, I kind of come down where Derek does. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you want China to be as dependent on the United States as possible. That's not what he was saying, but he kind of was saying it in the sense that the model for energy growth and energy reform, there's only one model where they can succeed, in terms of shale exploitation, and that's the U.S. one. So and with huge reform, if China reforms in the way we're talking about, market reform in the energy sector, we're talking about a different China, So that's what we want. So anyway, I think we agree on that.
Something I would like to add quickly is that when we are talking about the energy trade ties and how it's going to help our allies, I think having more supply, it also helps indirectly and affects the prices. And that's also how you're going to help our allies, because just look at the state of Pennsylvania's natural gas production in 2012 is just equal to the amount of Qatar's gas export. And having that American gas in the market sold as spot market, even if not to Japanese market, let's say, is going to affect the prices. And that price competition that creates and breaks the prices, that is going to have also an indirect effect on whoever you are looking for it to have.
Right, that's a great point. All right, we have about 35 minutes. Are there folks in the audience who want to pick at any of these issues? We've got practically the whole globe on the table here. Yeah.
I have a question that Dan and Derek would be able to answer. You mentioned the potential.
He's Dan's RA, by the way.
You mentioned China potentially turning to Russia as part of this agreement. What factors need to fall into place for that to happen? And then, Derek, what are sort of the economic factors involved?
Let me pull that out just a little bit. The question was asking Dan about the China-Russia relationship. What factors would cause that? Maybe also get your assessment of actually where are we now? Because I think there's been people have long been skeptical about the Russia-China relationship. Oh, it's very transactional. It'll never materialize to anything. Starting to see in arms sales, energy deals, doing things that look a little more serious. How concerned about are you, et cetera?
Well, as I wrote in my piece of the of this report, the global order right now, in terms of what I think are obviously ISIS and counterterrorism are very important, but the biggest challenge to this U.S.-led liberal order is the rise of these states with some revisionist ambitions. So Iran, Russia, and China, and the number one goal for the United States is to make sure that they don't band together and pose some kind of systemic threat to the global system. I mean, each one individually may pose some serious problems, whether in Europe in the case of Russia, or Iran, Persian Gulf in the case of Iran, or China in the case of East Asia. But we would face a whole different world if they were actually working together. So in terms of your question about the factors, number one is an alignment of views about both how threatening the United States is to their regimes and their strategies. That would tend towards alliance in the case of China and Russia. An alignment of views in terms of what vulnerabilities the U.S. might have, and whether an alliance might be able to undermine those vulnerabilities or take advantage of those vulnerabilities. And then, you'd have to overcome. I agree with Eli completely in this. I've been one of the skeptics of a China-Russia alignment, but you'd have to come. So oil and gas, Russia. This is where geopolitics and economics may come together. So Russia facing long-term sanctions on being able to export to Europe has only one option, and that is the Eastern option. And they write about that. It's in our report. And whether the Chinese also see some desperation in the future of not necessarily the global market from an economic point of view, but the global market from the perspective of U.S. dominance of the sea lanes and the Gulf and everywhere else, an alignment on oil and gas, not just on price, but on strategy. There you would see, and the Chinese kind of looking more intently on a continental option for gaining its natural resources. Yes, it's absolutely more expensive than doing it by sea. It is still risky because of terrorism and Central Asia, but perhaps China still has a lot of dollar reserves and is willing to spend it. Perhaps they will spend it on uneconomical projects even more going forward if they continue to perceive the maritime domain, or even more so after a U.S. strategic revival, the maritime domain as somewhat closed off to them. And those are the factors I think you would see in terms of pushing them closer together.
Just briefly on the economics, and I'm going to steal from Sarah, so maybe she'll want to comment as well. The way a Russia-China alliance works, from my perspective, is the Russians are desperate and are willing to be the junior partner. It's not going to be an equal partnership. The Chinese don't trust the Russians or need the Russians enough to make them an equal partner, and they're not an equal partner. So then we get into the point that Sarah brought up, which is how well are the Russians going to adapt to a period of lower energy prices? And Sarah, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but she was pretty optimistic about Iran's capacity to adapt, for example. I know nothing about the Iranian economy except for Chinese investment in Iran. The Russian economy is more screwed up than just about any major economy you can find. I mean, it's just a willful distortion over years. I mean, obviously North Korea is worse, but I'm not counting them. Among the economies you can look at, they've systematically ruined their economy's ability to function. So I don't know. Of course they're going to try to respond. Of course they can cut budget spending, including on defense. Of course, they can do things to mitigate, if we get a period of long-term weak oil prices, they can do things to mitigate their impact. But I just think they need so much capital. And there's really only one country that's going to provide them the capital now, because Europe's out of the picture for an indefinite period. And that's the Chinese, who, by the way, have a lot of capital they don't know what to do with. So everything lines up against a China-Russian alliance unless the Russians mess up sufficiently that they're willing to say, all right, you get ownership rights in these projects, whatever, we'll fix a price point. We won't do the games we've been playing with you for 15 years about, well, if prices go up, we don't want to sell it to you at that price. All the stuff that's been going on to now, the reason it changes is that Russia's too messed up economically to say no. And Sarah may be right that they can make an adjustment, but they don't really have a functioning economy anymore. So I'm not sure how quickly they would be able to respond to low energy prices. Eventually they would, and they would do some things right away, and I'm not enough of an expert on the Russian economy. I'm just saying that's the way this works. You get a China-Russian alliance where the Russians are like Venezuela rather than like Iran, and they're just stuck. The Venezuelans have nothing to do but turn to the Chinese. The Iranians have other things to do. Where's Russia on that spectrum?
To add a point here is when we are talking about this economy's resistance, we should just consider that how low and how long these prices are going and which price we're talking about. And in case of Iran that you mentioned, I mean, it also again goes to different scenarios. Iran under current sanction, Iran out of the sanctions. And again, going to Russia, if the current sanction remains on Russia and the current prices remain for some time, Russia is going to cannot offset the natural decline that it's going to have. So its export and production capacity is going to increase in the next decade. So I think it's very important. I really like the example that Senator Cassidy made about that rusted ships. I think it's very important, so you might not see something collapse very quickly, but you can see the economy or the fundamentals of a country start rusting because of but when is going to happen, how long is going to happen, and when is that breaking point?
That's right.
You might not be sure.
All right, well, raise your hand if you do have questions. I have another one here. Oh, we got her in the back. Okay, great, thank you.
I'm curious in the discussion of rising American crude production, what impact that has on our independence in terms of operating in the Middle East? And does it augur a possibility of us really withdrawing more from that region because we have less economic necessity
Let me, do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, rising American production, does that give us the option, or does it make it, likely that we're going to withdraw from the Middle East politically because we don't need Middle Eastern production anymore? I'm just going to make an economic observation and turn it over to Dan because I don't know about the politics. We actually greatly reduced our reliance on the Middle East long before shale. We switched to North American supplies, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela. In fact, before the shale revolution, the Chinese were jealous about the fact that we had gotten away from reduced reliance on the Middle East for oil. And yet, we did not reduce our Middle East involvement in political and military terms. So that's just an economic observation. The U.S. in 2008, before the shale revolution, is much less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than in 1978, but we're still heavily involved in the Middle East.
So I want Dan to answer this question, then I want Sarah to come in to answer the question of, even if the answer is yes, we're still going to be there for reason X, Y, and Z, what's the perceptions in the region of that, and does that have effects on how people are relating to the United States now?
Yeah, I would underscore Derek's point, which is, well, so far the answer is we're very involved in the Middle East, despite a shale revolution, and that's for a variety of reasons. One is we will, I think, always have an interest in the stability of the price of oil, even if even if we're not as involved with particular producers, like the Saudis and involved in the cartel. So we'll always have, and price factors include the openness of the Straits of Hormuz and other choke points, and onshore. How stable is Iraq is a big question. And if you want to take it even further, if just looking from an oil stability factor, does Iran become hegemonic, get nuclear weapons, and the rest of the region decide to also get nuclear weapons? I guess the price of oil will probably shoot up quite a bit, right? So from that, just from the global price of oil perspective, with all these non-market price factors, I think the U.S. will be involved for some time to come. And then there's the other issues, of relationship with Israel, of being the only country interested in the Palestinians and the peace process, on and on and on, and of course this question of proliferation. So, and then I'll just end on one interesting note, which is. Which means that everything I said beforehand was not that interesting. The big question is, how does China play? And I think somebody asked that question of Senator Cassidy in the Middle East, and that's changing. I mean, that is really changing in interesting ways because so now China is it thought all that Iraqi oil was going to China, right? And now it's, so there's this ongoing question among China hands of how big a role is China going to play in what we, liberal, small L liberals say, the provision of global goods, which I don't think translates into Chinese very well, but, the stability of the Middle East, the supply lines and all the rest of it. That's one question. Or counterterrorism, for that matter. How much is China, now that China is facing some serious jihadi terrorism of its own, how much of it is, how much are they going to play a role in the Middle East, and the stability of Iraq in, let's assume Iran does have a breakout capability in nuclear weapons. How does China play there? So that's where the sands kind of shift, even with everything we say, which is China is relatively less of a net demander of energy. It still is probably going to be the biggest demander of energy from the Middle East.
I think with regard to your question about reducing dependency to Middle East, never going to be zero. For most of the U.S. refineries are processing the heavy crude oil, and U.S. crude oil, the shale oil, is light crude oil. And most of the refineries, of course, don't want to switch their refineries to the light oil because they make lots of profit. Their margin of profit from processing heavy crude oil is higher than processing light crude oil. And the reason for that is that they're sophisticated. They can produce more light distillates from heavy crude oil, and many refineries in the world cannot do that, and heavy crude oil is cheaper. So they're going to use less pricey feedstock and produce more added value. So where do we have this heavy crude oil coming? Of course, we have Mexico, we have Canada. Venezuela we think that is not going to be a major supplier to U.S. anymore, and the reason for that is not just because U.S. doesn't want to buy from Venezuela, it's China. Chinese signed a big contract with Venezuela, and Venezuela is going to give them oil in return because they don't have enough cash to pay for all the investment Chinese are doing in their country. But Saudi Arabia very wisely kept a minimum market share in United States. So they have a 50% of share of the Motiva refinery in Port Arthur in Mexico, in Texas, sorry, and they are maintaining a minimum market share for themselves. So never you can stop Saudi Arabia to export crude oil to U.S. And last summer that the prices were above $100 in the United States, the price of oil was at least $10 to $15 less than the Asian market. But still, Saudi Arabia was exporting crude oil to the United States with $10 to $15 of discounts to keep that market share. So Saudi, at least from Saudi, talking about Middle Eastern oil exporter, is not going to. It's going to maintain its minimum market share. Something that the question that you asked about.
Perceptions of the role of the United States, or what are our interests? Is the shale revolution making us a less reliable partner?
I think being a less reliable partner when you're talking about Middle East, especially the Arab countries, I don't think only because of shale production, but just because the fact that how United States is, it makes you a less reliable ally for this country. Because culturally, when you are talking to an Arab sheikh, when you're talking about alliance for an Arab sheikh is a friendship forever. But for the United States, alliance evolved around the national security. So national security and national interest could change. I mean, the elements of that could change. For instance, tomorrow, United States could be allied with Iran. You know, if being alliance with Iran could.
Not if our friends here in the audience can help it.
I'm just making an example, of course, you know. So I'm just saying that how United States as a great power doesn't have a set friend or set enemies.
Right.
And this is just by nature a very shaky concept of relying on the United States for Arabs. And that's what we heard ourselves from the main Arab leaders, that a country that doesn't have a set friend or enemy could not be necessarily a reliable ally for us. So, of course, they keep their friendship because U.S. is a superpower, and, of course, everybody wants to be ally. That's in their benefit. But I think they are trying to independently gain influence, whether on U.S. policy, if they can maintain their minimum market share of oil, or just to form certain alliances that they can protect each other better.
In the absence of another question, let me kick another one at Derek here. A country we haven't talked about yet, India, but I know one you've looked at closely. A lot of excitement about India these days in Washington. Obviously not the size of the Chinese economy, but I think as of now, if not soon, growing faster than the Chinese economy. Talk to us a little about in the energy picture. How do they play? How are they relevant? How do they affect the geopolitics, et cetera?
Okay, so just like with China, which is in the report, India is not, because India's got a long way to go. I don't mean by 15 years when we're still going to be talking about Indian potential, but 15 years India could be where China is now. So we thought, India didn't deserve the same kind of weight, and it's not as interesting geopolitically either. But the matrix is the same, which is economic reform, yes or no, energy reform, yes or no. And there's a really wildly different pictures, because you can imagine an India that engages in fundamental economic reform, slowly because it's a democratic country and because India is slow at things, where land rights and labor rights are changed, and you get the kind of takeoff in India that everyone's been waiting for years. And that doesn't embrace energy. So then India becomes China too. It becomes this wild scavenger of energy because its economy is doing really well thanks to these very difficult, powerful reforms. And we do get a sustained period of very rapid Indian economic growth. But energy is kind of, an afterthought. It's doing better, but it's not nearly keeping pace with first agricultural production, manufacturing, into the huge Indian labor force. The Indian story is reliant on energy being okay. It's not reliant on energy being good. So you could get to a place where India becomes a huge demander of energy around the world and sort of takes China's place. Not next year or the year after, in the 2020s sometime, if then. But you can also tell a story, and we're seeing India try to reform its coal sector right now in a very dramatic way, where the Indians supply their own energy. The Indians right now are already sizable energy importers. I can easily imagine that being taken off the market. So you get another hit. In addition to Chinese demand slowing, you get the Indians supplying more of their own energy. They're very nationalistic in that respect. They don't like energy imports. Most countries don't, but India is probably a little stronger than most. So you're absolutely right to ask about India. One of the reasons I didn't want to be in the report is because I didn't have a clear answer. I know China's economy is slowing. I know that. That's done. They have to change course. The Indian economy, they're suggesting we might get a takeoff, but we're not there yet by any means. And then we have the whole energy factor, which is, does the energy sector lag the economy, or is it out in front? Do we get a much higher Indian net energy demand, or do we actually get no Indian net energy demand because they provide their own energy? Very aggressive on renewables. They have a ton of unexploited coal. We have no idea what their shale capacity is because their state-owned energy companies are incompetent. So there's a huge variation with India that makes it very interesting to watch. But as Senator Cassidy has said, as Sarah said, India is like a classic example of why you don't predict the oil market. Because 10 years from now, we could be saying, man, the Indians are driving oil prices higher. That's crazy. Or we could be saying, India, no, they don't really play a role here.
It's a very good segue to, there's almost no very, very positive energy story that doesn't involve, a massive transformation of India or China, right? And so it's interesting to think back from a national security perspective or a foreign policy perspective. China made a series of decisions in the 1970s and 1980s, of which we're living off of right now, right? So it was essentially to ratify the entrepreneurial behavior of farmers and peasants and go forward with that. We like in the strategy community to think that it was all part of a grand strategic plan somewhere in the Politburo, but once China began to grow in that nature, and particularly in become a maritime trading nation, and then look to the maritime realm in order to protect its interest, then the grand strategic plans kind of followed. With India, from a national security and a strategy point of view, we would absolutely love for India to be a major player in international affairs, but unless there are decisions being made right now that we can't quite see that are going to gradually transform India into a market economy, that kind of has to stop us from some of our grand plans for India. Now, on the reverse side of that, if it does do that in the next 5 years, it really starts to undertake these market reforms, then we will see an India transformed, and we will see an India transformed in terms of an energy player, but also maybe more of a maritime player. Then you can start to really see the U.S. and China, the U.S. and India, and the kind of relationship that we would imagine for it. But again, it goes back to one of the eye-opening things about a national security person doing work with an economics person is, how much of it is decisions by private entrepreneurs and economists and economic policymakers in that country to start their country on a certain course.
Okay, well, we have 10 minutes left. I guess what I'd like to ask you to do, I know this, given that the report is about scenarios in the future and uncertainty, and I think we've talked about this a lot, but maybe I'll give you each of a chance to talk about, from your perspective, from the issues that you sunk your teeth into in this report, maybe just close by spending a few minutes talking about what you think are the most interesting uncertainties, what the folks in the crowd here should be looking toward to better understand where these trends are going in the next, say, 2 to 3 years. Yeah, why don't we start?
I mentioned this with the senator because I wanted to get his perspective. I think the big question is shale exportable? I don't think, there are all these uncertainties. I don't think the Chinese are going to reform their economy. I'm not sure. So I got a story for China, which is China stagnating. I don't think U.S. politicians are going to intervene in shale production and kill the U.S. shale story. I'm not sure about that, but I doubt it. So is it just going to be the United States having transformed itself in terms of a major energy producer? Or are other countries going to follow? How many other countries? What countries? Can Britain do it? I mean, isn't Britain like the United States? Being silly. Isn't Britain like the United States? They have shale. What about Poland? You know, Argentina, which so badly needs to develop its energy resources and just doesn't seem to be capable. So to me, the big area that changes not the American outcome so much, but the geopolitical outcome, where the U.S. is the superpower, is OPEC dead? Are we just going to kill OPEC because we're going to have shale production in all of these countries all around the world? Or, as it turns out, no. I mean, this is a big America story. Hooray for us, pat ourselves on the back. But the rest of the world is pretty much going to be the same. And that is just, you know, there's so many factors involved, individual decisions in the countries, which we've just been talking about with regard to India. So that, to me, is the big issue. And that's why I sort of focus on what is it about shale in the U.S., specifically that's most important, and how does that transport? And does it transport to some countries and not to others, or does it not transport anywhere? That's the major source of uncertainty, and that's the major thing I would watch for both economics and geopolitics.
And can I just ask one question about this? This notion of there's sort of this package that you need to put shale together, and a lot of that was not just the legal system we've had today, but the entrepreneurial spirit that got to the technological development. So that now we have that. That can be taken to the world. To what extent, and again, it's an uncertainty, you're talking about an uncertainty, but to what extent, now that the United States has done the hard work of getting this stuff online, can it be taken to these countries who may be motivated? Have we done most of the hard work, or are the legal frameworks and land laws and all that so profoundly important that we're not talking about as much? It's much more difficult than, hey, bring your rig over here.
I think more of the latter. We've done something indispensable, which was give people an incentive to look at this, because, you know, otherwise you're just saying, hey, this would be good for you. You know, we say so, and they look at you like, yeah, where's the evidence? So now we have the evidence. This really will pay off for you if you can do it. But the hard work is still there, as starting with, if you have the state controlling the energy resources, the state is usually pretty happy about the way things are going. You know, you work for the government, you work for a state-owned oil company, things aren't so bad. Just like things weren't so bad for a private oil company, a big private oil company in 2007. It's people have to have a stake in upsetting that. And that comes from, I own my land. I can bring in a foreign shale partner, an American shale partner, and the government won't interfere and take a huge slice of my profits. I can get funding from a bank because they're willing to take risks in case this doesn't work. And so I think the hard work, you know, we have the model out there. We have a role model we provided, but the hard work still has to be done in these countries. And most of them are probably going to fail. I know I'm very cynical about the role of government, but I think most of them are going to fail. And the reason we succeeded is the government doesn't drive the energy sector. And that's, you know, in various ways what you need to see overseas, which is a big change for most of these countries.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, so Sarah, the Middle East, lots of uncertainty there. Obviously, huge question marks region around. But when it comes to the energy question, what are the key issues to look at in the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, I already mentioned that Middle East is going to have slight increase of production, but their own domestic demand is growing faster, and they're going to maintain their current market share, if not losing some of it, but they're not going to contribute a lot to increasing additional supply in the market, very little. But something that I think is important and will change is that, I mean, Derek already spoke a lot about it, is that if this shale is only a U.S. phenomena or is going to be a global phenomena, I think, especially with the current prices and the prospect of the market, this is going to mainly stay in the United States because of all the nature of the market in the United States that Derek discussed extensively about it. And I mean, no other country, at least at this moment, is at that capacity to with the current prices and with the current technology that we have and the cost of producing shale to produce this, to do this massive drilling and maintain the production, unless some new type of technology come and technology improve and the cost of production reduces. And something important is that the current price is going to change different things. So we're going to see the change in trade ties. The change in trade ties is going to change the implications of political and international relation between different countries, and geopolitics of energy could change because of this change of energy ties. But also is that investment, where the investors are going to be. We are always talking about the relatively more efficient oil, means that the oils that have lower cost of production mainly like, let's say, in Persian Gulf. But Now something will be very important for investors, and that's the terms of that they're going to negotiate in terms of investment. And those countries, like again we mentioned, we talk about Mexico, like Mexico, that they changed their energy and hydrocarbon law, and they are more willing to share more profit and negotiate and show more flexibilities with investors are going to be the points of interest for investors at the time of the lower oil prices.
Great. Dan, you want to bring us home here?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in terms of things to watch for, number one definitely is U.S. political leaders. I mean, it's one thing to say in a report and in other places that, wow, we had this revolution, we're more rich and more powerful than we thought. It's another thing for leaders and the people to feel it and to therefore say, look, for not that much money, we can stay a superpower and actually fund ourselves as a superpower and bring some stability to the world for some time. And that's something to really watch for, because that's going to happen through very tough political debates. And I don't know when that perception changes from, well, this is a good story, to, wow, we're back. So that's one thing to watch for, I think. The second issue, I think, is geopolitics doesn't stop, as I said. So China will fight back and try to reverse its fortunes, particularly if they see a revival of U.S. power as something threatening. And that's where you really need to look at the kinds of relationships that they develop with oil producers and energy producers that may not make sense from an economic point of view, but may make sense from a fear point of view. And how much money they would be spending in that way. And I would say, and then the other thing is, I always get the black swan thing wrong, because I'm not sure if it's something you can see or can't see or whatever it is. But we have these other emerging Asia countries that, if we pass a TPP, could be massive economies with massive energy needs, Vietnam being one of them. So that's just something to watch for, which you could see some of these countries exploding in the ways that Korea did in the 1980s. And of course, India is the big question. I mean, if India gets a little bit of market reform right, it'll transform the world as well as the energy market.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming out on this snowy day, and make sure you grab a copy of the report on your way out. And thanks to Dan and Sarah and Derek for a great discussion.
Thank you.